Hello, everybody. This is another episode of Morning Jim. After an enervating week such as we've had with our election hijinks, a little poetry might not seem too bad. Get yourself a cup of coffee or tea to help you relax. Actually, in my case, I have this medical grade caffeinated coffee because I'm relaxing too much without it. Poetry might feel good, in fact, like a gentle massage after a painful workout, such as we've had this past week. In the main poem today, there's a line saying, "Poetry makes nothing happen." Unlike politics, which more often than not makes things worse, poetry by comparison is a real pleasure. We shall soon find out in America which it's going to be. I'm afraid we already know, and I'm not going to make any political comments at this time because America will go on no matter which jingo is temporarily in charge. So, I'm going to start with a poem by W.H. Auden. For me, he's the premier poet of the 20th century in the English language. He had it all. He was a technical virtuoso. He could write in almost any verse form. He incorporated current events and pop culture as well as classical allusions. And as a graduate of Oxford, he had plenty of those classical allusions to share. And he had a vast range of knowledge and intellect. The poem I'm going to read today is called In Memory of W.B. Yeats. It is in 3 distinct parts with different verse forms in each part, and it's longer than I usually try you with, but this poem, I think, is worth it. Incidentally, William Butler Yeats was an Irish poet and playwright who is credited with reviving Irish culture in the early part of the 20th century after the rebellions and political trials that the Irish underwent. Yeats died in January 1939, so this poem was written in that year. And so the opening lines of the poem are true and not metaphorical. I'm going to read this poem out of the collected works of W.H. Auden, which I purchased as a university student at Stanford many, many years ago. And here's the poem. He disappeared in the dead of winter. The brooks were frozen, the airports almost deserted, and snow disfigured the public statues. The mercury sank in the mouth of the dying day. Oh, all the instruments agree, the day of his death was a dark, cold day. Far from his illness, the wolves ran on through the evergreen forests. The peasant river was untempted by the fashionable quays, by morning tongues. The death of the poet was kept from his poems. But for him, it was his last afternoon as himself, an afternoon of nurses and rumors. The provinces of his body revolted. The squares of his mind were empty. Silence invaded the suburbs. The current of his feeling failed. He became his admirers. Now he is scattered among 100 cities and wholly given over to unfamiliar affections, to find his happiness in another kind of wood and be punished under a foreign code of conscience. The words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. But in the importance and noise of tomorrow, when the brokers are roaring like beasts on the floor of the bourse, and the poor have the sufferings to which they are fairly accustomed, and each in the cell of himself is almost convinced of his freedom, a few thousand will think of this day, as one thinks of a day when one did something slightly unusual. Oh, all the instruments agree. The day of his death was a dark, cold day. Part 2. You were silly like us. Your gifts survived it all. The perish of rich women, physical decay, yourself. Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. Now Ireland has her madness and her weather still, for poetry makes nothing happen. It survives in the valley of its saying, where executives would never want to tamper. It flows south from ranches of isolation and the busy griefs. Raw towns that we believe and die in. It survives a way of happening, a mouth. Part 3. Earth, receive an honored guest. William Yeats is laid to rest. Let the Irish vessel lie emptied of its poetry. Time that is intolerant of the brave and innocent, and indifferent and a weak to a beautiful physique, worships language, and forgives everyone by whom it lives, pardons cowardice, conceit, lays its honors at their feet. Time that with this strange excuse pardoned Kipling and his views, and will pardon Paul Claudel, pardons him for writing well. In the nightmare of the dark, all the dogs of Europe bark, and the living nations wait, each sequestered in its hate. Intellectual disgrace stares from every human face, and the seas of pity lie locked and frozen in each eye. Follow, poet, follow right to the bottom of the night. With your unconstraining voice, still persuade us to rejoice. With the farming of a verse, make a vineyard of the curse, sing of human unsuccess in a rapture of distress. In the deserts of the heart, let the healing fountain start. In the prison of his days, teach the free man how to praise. Between the writing of this poetry in 1940 and 1959, when another edition of his poems came out, and I have that also, a funny thing happened, and that is that 4 of the stanzas of this poem disappeared. And they were some of my favorite stanzas. Time that is intolerant of the brave and innocent, and indifferent and a weak to a beautiful physique, worships language and forgives everyone by whom it lives, pardons cowardice, conceit, lays its honors at their feet. And then the one about Kipling and Paul Claudel, those 4. Now, I suspect that Auden removed those. I don't think that that was an editorial disgrace committed by some editor of later editions. I think it would have been after World War II that he made the change. And perhaps he didn't think allusions to Kipling and Paul Claudel were nearly as important as getting at the essence of the war. And so he went right into the Nightmare of the Dark, All the Dogs of Europe bark stanza. That's just my reading of this. And I don't know if it's right or not, but I'm sticking with it until somebody educates me otherwise. I had the great fortune to hear Auden read his poetry when I was just a freshman at Stanford University way back in 1955. He was a big, craggy man with a greatly wrinkled face that looked like the flesh was cascading down his forehead to his chin. I'm getting to the point where I sort of have that sense myself. But his voice was deep and clear, and he awakened in me a taste for poetry that has never gone away, even at times when I wished it would. I'm going to conclude with a poem I just wrote this past week. I write my poetry in fits and starts, and I take long vacations between poems. When you're my age, that's kind of the way it is. This poem's about my late wife, Marcia. And as I know many of you will catch that right from the beginning, I think most of it is very self-explanatory. And it's called Last Drive. I remember the day when she drove her cherished, gleaming old black Jaguar home and put it flawlessly into the garage. Home late, but her hair was newly coiffed. It was a warm fall day. We stood together in the breeze. Do bad things happen on such fine, dry, sunny days? Can that be when the late roses give off faint, sweet scents and nod their pink heads in the soft air? I said that perhaps they made her wait a long time. No, she said, but when I left there were signs saying detour. So I took a detour, which went downtown, and then after going around several confusing blocks, I found a familiar street and came home. It was all so sweetly said and straightforward. We had gone to a psychologist that spring for tests, and so we both knew she had the big A. We cried together that day, and I held her close. That's all for this episode. I hope your coffee has stayed warm. Mine's cooling down, I have to admit. I hope I'll see you next week. That's all for now. Blessings to everyone. Bye now.